I am Richard Alden, 70 years old, and somehow still fighting battles my own blood started. As the founder of a $60 million logistics empire, I thought I had secured my family's future. Last Tuesday, I dropped my son at the airport for a business trip. 10 minutes later, my housekeeper called with a frantic warning. "Don't go home. Check the security cameras." I pulled over, opened the app, and watched my son lead 3 men in medical scrubs into my private study. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The morning sun over Los Angeles was blinding, glaring off the endless sea of cars stacked up at the airport departure terminal. I drummed my fingers against the leather steering wheel of my sedan, listening to the dull hum of the engine and the roar of jets climbing into the sky. Next to me sat Bradley, my 38-year-old son. He looked immaculate in his tailored navy suit, checking his expensive watch for the 3rd time in as many minutes. He was supposed to be heading to Chicago for a week-long logistics conference representing Alden Logistics, the company I had built with my bare hands over 4 grueling decades. I glanced at him. Bradley had the polish I never possessed. I grew up with grease under my fingernails, unloading cargo off freight ships, fighting for every dollar, every contract, every inch of ground in the supply chain industry. Bradley grew up with private schools, country clubs, and corner offices. I wanted him to have it easier than I did. I wanted him to step into a ready-made empire. But looking at him now tapping his screen with a soft, uncalloused thumb, I felt a familiar, quiet friction. A creeping thought that maybe I had made things too easy for him. We pulled up to Terminal 3. I shifted the car into park and unlocked the doors. Bradley grabbed his leather overnight bag from the back seat. He turned to me, flashing that perfectly practiced corporate smile he usually reserved for clients. "Have a good trip, son," I told him, keeping my voice steady. "Close the Chicago deal. Show them what Alden Logistics brings to the table." "I will, Dad," he replied smoothly. "Don't worry about the business. Just relax this week. Take it easy." He stepped out of the car, slamming the door. But before he walked away, he leaned back down, resting his forearms on the open passenger window. His eyes swept over my face, and that smile of his morphed into something subtly patronizing. It was the kind of look a parent gives a toddler who doesn't understand a simple instruction. "Make sure you lock the doors tonight, Dad," he said, his voice dropping an octave, dripping with fake concern. "Your memory hasn't been great lately. You left the back gate unlocked twice this month. I don't want you getting confused and wandering around." I stared back at him. My memory was as sharp as a razor. I knew exactly where every asset, every truck, and every dollar of my $60 million company was at any given second. I hadn't left any gates unlocked, but I didn't argue. I had noticed this new habit of his over the past few months. These little comments, these quiet jabs aimed at making me feel fragile. I chalked it up to him wanting to assert dominance, eager to push the old man into a rocking chair so he could finally run the show. "I will be perfectly fine, Bradley," I said, my tone flattening. "Just catch your flight." He tapped the roof of the car, twice smirked, and vanished into the crowded terminal. I rolled up the window, merged back into the chaotic airport traffic, and headed toward the 405 freeway. The tension in my shoulders began to ease. A week without Bradley hovering around the house trying to manage my diet, my schedule and my life sounded like a vacation. I looked forward to the silence of my home. Traffic on the 405 was its usual crawling nightmare. I was in the fast lane listening to a jazz station, watching the sprawling concrete landscape of Los Angeles creep by. I had just passed the exit for Santa Monica when my phone buzzed in the cup holder. I ignored it. I have a strict rule about looking at screens while driving. But then it buzzed again, and again. 3 rapid, aggressive vibrations. Frowning, I glanced down at the screen. The notifications were from Rosa. Rosa had been my housekeeper for 10 years. She was a stoic, no-nonsense woman who treated my home with absolute respect. She never texted me during the day unless a pipe had burst or the alarm system was malfunctioning. She certainly never spammed my phone like a panicked teenager. I tapped the screen to read the preview. Mr. Alden, do not go home. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I hit the blinker aggressively, cut across 2 lanes of heavy traffic, to the chorus of blaring horns, and pulled onto the shoulder of the freeway. The tires crunched over the gravel as I threw the car into park. I picked up the phone, my heart giving a slow, heavy thud. There were 3 messages in total. Mr. Alden, do not go home. Pull over somewhere safe immediately. Check camera number 4. They just fired me and forced me out. I stared at the glowing letters. They fired me. Who was they? My wife had passed away years ago. Monica, my daughter-in-law, lived in the guest house on the estate with Bradley, but she had absolutely no authority over my staff. Rosa answered to me and only me. And why was Rosa telling me not to go to my own house? A cold, deeply rooted instinct flared to life inside my chest. It was the same survival instinct that had saved me from bad business deals and ruthless competitors over the decades. Something was horribly wrong. My thumb hovered over Rosa's contact, ready to call her, but her instructions stopped me. Check camera number 4. Camera number 4 was positioned in the main hallway of my mansion, pointing directly at the heavy oak double doors of my private study. The study where I kept my physical ledgers, the master safe, and the legal deeds to my properties. Nobody went in there without my explicit permission. Not Rosa, not Monica, not Bradley. I opened the security application on my phone. The screen went black for a second, a small loading circle spinning in the center. I could hear the cars rushing past me on the freeway, the wind shaking my vehicle, but my entire focus narrowed down to that little spinning circle. The live feed flickered onto the screen. The hallway was perfectly illuminated by the morning light streaming through the skylights. At first it was empty. Then the heavy front doors of the mansion swung open. I held my breath. 4 figures stepped into the entryway. My eyes immediately locked onto the man leading the group. He was wearing a tailored navy suit. He carried a leather overnight bag. It was Bradley. My son, who I had watched walk into an airport terminal 30 miles away just 20 minutes ago, was standing inside my house. He had never intended to get on that plane. The Chicago conference was a lie. The overnight bag was a prop. But that was not the detail that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was the 3 men walking directly behind him. They were big, thick-necked men wearing light blue medical scrubs. They carried heavy black duffel bags, the kind used by paramedics or emergency responders. I watched through the grainy resolution of the camera as Bradley pointed a finger directly at the doors of my private study. The 3 men nodded. One of the men in scrubs unzipped his black bag as they approached the study doors. He pulled something out. It was thick canvas material with long straps, a heavy-duty medical straitjacket. Another man reached into his pocket and pulled out a long metallic object that caught the light of the hallway. A medical syringe. Bradley stood aside, crossing his arms over his chest, his face completely devoid of emotion as he watched the men open the doors to my study and walk inside. He looked calm, calculated, patient. He was waiting for something. He was waiting for me to come home. The sheer gravity of what I was witnessing slammed into me. The fake business trip. The patronizing comment about my failing memory. The unceremonious firing of my loyal housekeeper to ensure there were no witnesses. My own flesh and blood had laid a trap in my living room, intending to ambush me with men armed with sedatives and restraints. I sat alone in my car on the side of the bustling freeway, the silence inside the cabin deafening. I did not panic. I did not cry. The shock quickly burned away, leaving nothing but a cold, razor-sharp clarity. They thought I was an old, clueless man whose mind was slipping. They thought they could cage the wolf in his own den. I locked my phone screen and placed it carefully on the passenger seat. I gripped the steering wheel, took a slow, deep breath, and prepared to dismantle my son's life. I reached for my phone, my thumb sliding over the glass screen. I needed to test the water. I needed to see exactly how deep this deception ran before I made my next move. I dialed Bradley's number. The line rang twice before he picked up. Immediately, a wave of ambient noise flooded the speaker. The muffled, echoing announcements of flight delays, the rolling chatter of a crowded terminal, the distinct rhythmic clacking of suitcase wheels rolling over tile floors. It was a flawless audio track. "Hey, Dad," Bradley said, raising his voice slightly as if fighting to be heard over the airport intercom. "Did you make it back to the house yet?" I stared at the security feed on my dashboard. Bradley was standing in the dead center of my silent, sunlit study, a phone pressed to his ear. "Not yet," I replied, forcing my voice into the casual, slightly tired tone of an old man navigating Los Angeles traffic. "I pulled over to grab a coffee. Just wanted to make sure you made it through security all right. The lines looked terrible when I dropped you off." "Oh, it was a total nightmare," Bradley lied smoothly, pacing across my vintage Persian rug. "But I made it through. I am sitting at gate 12 right now. They are starting the boarding process in about 10 minutes. He did not stammer. He did not hesitate. The boy I had raised, the son I had trusted to inherit my life's work, was looking at my mahogany desk while effortlessly painting a picture of an airport terminal 30 miles away. "Good," I said. "Have a safe flight. Call me when you land in Chicago." "Will do, Dad. Get some rest today." The line went dead. I lowered the phone. A heavy, suffocating chill settled deep into my bones. He had a soundboard prepared. This was not a spur-of-the-moment lapse in judgment. This was a highly coordinated, meticulously planned operation. If Bradley was the actor on the stage, someone else was writing the script. Bradley was far too weak, far too impulsive to engineer something this flawless. He lacked the nerve to coordinate a home invasion. I needed to speak to the director of this little play. I dialed Monica's number. My daughter-in-law had always been a master of appearances. From the moment Bradley brought her home, she had played the role of the devoted, caring addition to the family. She was always the first to pour my tea, the first to ask about my doctor appointments, the first to suggest that I take a step back from the company to enjoy my golden years. I had mistaken her constant hovering for genuine affection. I now understood it was simply tactical reconnaissance. The phone rang exactly 3 times before she answered. "Dad," Monica said, her voice bright, sweet, and perfectly composed. "I am so glad you called. Are you on your way back? Still stuck on the freeway?" I lied, leaning back against the leather seat of my car. "Traffic is backed up past Culver City. I just wanted to check in. I spoke to Bradley a minute ago. He is at the gate." "Yes, he just texted me," Monica replied effortlessly. Her tone was light, airy, the absolute picture of a dutiful wife. "Listen, Dad, do not be alarmed when you get home. I had to make an executive decision while you were driving." "An executive decision?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "I noticed a water stain on the ceiling below your master bathroom this morning," she explained, her voice dripping with artificial concern. "I did not want to risk a pipe bursting while you were home alone, so I called an emergency plumbing service. They are at the house right now taking a look at it." The absolute sociopathic calm in her voice was breathtaking. She was providing a cover story for the men in the house just in case I arrived earlier than expected and saw strange vehicles parked in my driveway. She was ensuring I would walk through the front door completely disarmed, expecting to greet a crew of blue-collar workers fixing a leak. "I see," I said, keeping my breathing slow and measured. "That was very thoughtful of you, Monica. I appreciate you taking care of that. Are they going to be there long?" "They should be wrapping up soon," she reassured me. "I told them to let themselves out if you weren't back. I also set the coffee maker for you. I know how much you hate dealing with that machine. Just press the button when you get inside." "You always think of everything," I murmured. "We just want you to be comfortable, Dad. Drive safe." She hung up. I sat in the stifling heat of my car, staring at the blank screen of my phone. Plumbers. A master bathroom leak. A fresh pot of coffee waiting for me. The sheer scale of their arrogance was staggering. They had mapped out every detail of my routine, anticipating my reactions, treating me like a predictable, senile asset ready for liquidation. They thought they had accounted for every variable. They forgot that I spent 40 years anticipating supply chain disruptions before they happened. I picked up my phone and reopened the security application, pulling up the live feed from camera number 4. I maximized the screen, pinching the glass to zoom in tightly on the study. The 3 men were still standing there, taking instructions from my son. I studied the men Monica had called emergency plumbers. I looked at their hands. I looked at the black canvas duffel bags resting on the floor. There were absolutely no wrenches. There were no pipe cutters, no sealing tape, no toolboxes. One of the men, a giant with thick arms and a shaved head, reached into his bag and pulled out the heavy leather straitjacket, testing the strength of the buckles. The second man stood near the bookshelf, calmly preparing a medical syringe, tapping the glass vial with a thick finger to clear the air bubbles. They were not here to fix a leak. They were an extraction team. My gaze shifted to Bradley. He stood at the head of my desk, the desk where I had spent countless nights building the wealth he so desperately wanted to inherit. He unzipped his leather overnight bag, reached inside, and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He laid the papers flat on the mahogany surface, smoothing them out with the palm of his hand. The camera resolution was high enough for me to see the emblem stamped on the top page. It was the official, unmistakable red seal of the Superior Court of California. This was the real endgame. They were not just stealing money behind my back. They were going to strip away my fundamental human rights. They intended to declare me mentally incompetent and seize total legal control over my life, my assets, and my freedom. I was going to be locked in a cage entirely dependent on the 2 people who had built it for me. The hunt had officially begun. The panic that should have paralyzed me was instantly swallowed by a cold, familiar calculus. When you spend 4 decades building a $60 million supply chain empire from a single rusted delivery truck, you learn very early on that emotion is a liability. Panic does not meet payroll. Fear does not optimize freight routes. Anger does not negotiate favorable port tariffs. In my world, when a crisis hits, you do not freeze. You analyze the variables, you identify the point of failure, and you execute a solution with absolute ruthless precision. I leaned back, ignoring the roar of traffic rushing past my window. I closed my eyes, allowing my mind to strip away the illusion of my peaceful family life. I needed to examine the raw data of the past 6 months. The pieces of the puzzle, previously scattered and confusing, began to snap into place with terrifying clarity. It started in late autumn. I had always been an early riser, the kind of man who was at the warehouse by 5 in the morning sharp and ready for the day. But around November, a strange, suffocating fatigue began to anchor me to my bed. My limbs felt heavy, like they were filled with wet sand. I would wake up with a dull, throbbing ache at the base of my skull and a thick, disorienting fog clouding my thoughts. I had visited my longtime physician, and he had gently suggested that at 70 years old, my body was simply asking for a slower pace. I had believed him. I had accepted the natural decline of aging, but it was not natural. I thought about the humiliating incident with my car keys last month. I had placed them on the kitchen counter exactly where I had placed them every single day for the last 15 years. An hour later, they were gone. I had spent 45 minutes tearing the house apart in a frantic search. Monica had been the one to find them miraculously tucked inside the refrigerator next to a carton of milk. She had looked at me with such overwhelming pity, gently placing her hand on my shoulder, whispering that it was perfectly normal to have memory lapses at my age. Bradley had been standing in the doorway, shaking his head with a heavy performative sigh. They had orchestrated the entire event. They had moved the keys to make me doubt my own sanity. Then there was the coffee. Monica had been so insistent on taking over my morning routine. She claimed she had found a specialty organic roast from a boutique cafe downtown and wanted to prepare it for me every morning. She said it was her way of showing appreciation for everything I provided for them. Every single morning, she would bring a steaming ceramic mug into my study, lingering just long enough to watch me take the first few sips. And every single morning, within 30 minutes of finishing that cup, the heavy, suffocating brain fog would roll in. I would struggle to read my financial reports. The numbers on the spreadsheets would blur and dance across the page. My hands would develop a subtle, uncontrollable tremor. I was not losing my mind. I was being systematically, deliberately poisoned. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train, but I kept my breathing steady. They were dosing me. They were using some kind of chemical sedative, carefully measuring out, just enough to mimic the symptoms of severe cognitive decline, but not enough to put me in the hospital where a blood test might reveal their treachery. They needed a medical paper trail of my supposed deterioration. They needed a documented history of confusion, lethargy, and memory loss. That was the only way a judge would ever sign off on an emergency conservatorship. They needed me to look like a helpless, broken old man who could no longer manage a vast corporate empire. I opened my eyes and stared out through the windshield at the endless stream of cars on the freeway. The medical scrubs, the heavy leather straitjacket, the syringe. It all made perfect, sickening sense now. The men in my house were not there to fix a plumbing leak. They were an extraction team. Bradley and Monica were going to wait for me to come home. Monica would serve me a fresh cup of coffee, likely spiked with a massive, paralyzing dose of whatever chemical they had been feeding me. Once I collapsed, the men in scrubs would restrain me. They would use the legal documents stamped with the seal of the Superior Court to forcibly commit me to a private, highly secure psychiatric facility. Once I was locked behind steel doors, heavily medicated, and completely isolated from the outside world, Bradley would assume total legal control of Alden Logistics. He would have unchecked access to my bank accounts, my property deeds, and my investment portfolios. He would liquidate my life's work while I wasted away in a padded room, unable to call my lawyer or access my funds. It was a flawless, merciless corporate takeover executed from inside my own home. I reached out and picked up my phone from the passenger seat. I needed to move, but I needed to do so without triggering any alarms. In the logistics business, tracking your assets is the difference between a profitable quarter and bankruptcy. Every single truck in my commercial fleet was equipped with a state-of-the-art real-time satellite tracking system. I had applied that same principle to my personal vehicles. I opened the fleet management application on my phone and brought up the diagnostics for my sedan. The primary global positioning signal was functioning perfectly, pinging my location on the shoulder of the 405 freeway. But as I scrolled through the raw diagnostic data, my eyes caught a secondary frequency. It was a faint parasitic signal bouncing off the cellular towers, transmitting a parallel location packet every 30 seconds. My vehicle's computer system had detected an unauthorized external broadcast source, drawing a minuscule amount of power from the battery. I unbuckled my seatbelt, opened the car door, and stepped out into the chaotic noise of the highway traffic. The afternoon sun beat down on my shoulders as I knelt on the hot asphalt. I reached under the front bumper, running my hands along the metal chassis, feeling blindly past the plastic shielding and the steering column joints. My fingers brushed against something that did not belong. It was a small rectangular plastic box, about the size of a deck of cards, held firmly in place by a heavy-duty magnetic mount. I pulled it loose and brought it out into the sunlight. It was a commercial-grade long life tracking beacon. It had a small blinking green light indicating it was actively transmitting. Bradley had not just planned an ambush at the house. He was monitoring my exact movements in real time. They knew exactly where I was, and they were watching to see what I would do next. The trap was set, the executioners were waiting, and they were hunting my every move. I placed the tracking beacon back under the bumper, ensuring the magnet clicked against the chassis. If I destroyed the device, Bradley would know I found it. I needed him to believe I was wandering blindly through Los Angeles. I slid into the driver's seat, put the car in gear, and merged into traffic. I took the next exit, driving surface streets until I found a crowded outdoor mall. I navigated the labyrinth of parked cars pulling into a shaded spot on the third level of a parking garage. I turned off the engine and locked the doors. My vehicle and the tracker attached to it would remain sitting quietly, transmitting a mundane location to my son's phone. I walked down the stairwell to the street level and hailed a taxi. I gave the driver the address for a rundown diner on the edge of the city limits. It was a place disconnected from the polished world Bradley and Monica inhabited. I sat in the back of the cab, watching the glittering high-rises give way to faded strip malls. When the cab pulled into the parking lot, I paid the driver in cash and stepped out into the smoggy air. The parking lot was mostly empty. I walked over to a weathered wooden bench near the back entrance and sat down to wait. 10 minutes later, a faded blue sedan turned off the main road and crunched over the gravel, pulling into a spot a few yards away. The engine sputtered and died. The driver's side door opened and Rosa stepped out. She looked entirely different from the efficient housekeeper who had managed my estate for 10 years. Her shoulders were hunched, her hands were trembling, and her eyes darted nervously. She clutched a leather handbag tightly against her chest as she hurried over to the bench. I stood up to greet her, but she held up a shaking hand, gesturing for me to sit back down. "Mr. Alden," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "I am so sorry. I did not know who else to call. I had to warn you." "Take a deep breath, Rosa," I said, keeping my voice low. "You did the right thing. Tell me what happened after I left this morning." Rosa swallowed hard, gripping her handbag. "Miss Monica came into the kitchen right after you drove away. She told me my services were no longer required. She handed me a severance check and told me I had 20 minutes to pack my things and leave. She watched me the entire time. But I saw the men arrive. They did not look like plumbers. They looked dangerous." "I know," I replied smoothly. "They are an extraction team. They are waiting for me to come home so they can lock me away." Rosa let out a gasp, pressing a hand to her mouth. She reached into her handbag with trembling fingers. "I knew something was terribly wrong," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Miss Monica has been acting strange for months, always locking the door to her guest house, always watching you eat. Last night she asked me to take out the trash from her bathroom. I noticed something at the bottom of the bin. She tried to bury it under paper towels, but I saw it and dug it out." Rosa pulled her hand out of her purse. She was holding 2 items. The first was a prepaid cellular phone. The second was a small amber plastic prescription bottle. The label had been scraped off, leaving behind a sticky mess of paper and adhesive. "I bought the phone with cash," Rosa explained, handing both items to me. "I thought your phone might be compromised. But you need to look at the pills. I watched her last week. She thought I was vacuuming the hallway, but I saw her in the kitchen. She used a metal spoon to crush a pill into white powder. Then she stirred it into your morning coffee. She has been poisoning you." I took the bottle from her shaking hands. The plastic rattled slightly as I turned it over. I could see several small, chalky white tablets resting at the bottom. The profound truth of the past 6 months was suddenly heavy in my palm. The brain fog, the fatigue, the memory lapses. It had been meticulously administered by the woman who smiled at me every morning. "Thank you, Rosa," I said, looking her directly in the eyes. "You have saved my life. I need you to leave the city. Take that severance check, cash it immediately, and stay with your sister for a few days. Do not answer calls from my son or daughter-in-law. I will contact you when it is safe." She nodded quickly, tears welling in the corners of her eyes. "Please be careful, Mr. Alden. They are planning something terrible." "I know," I told her. "But they have severely underestimated who they are dealing with." I watched Rosa hurry back to her sedan. She started the engine, threw the car into reverse, and sped out of the parking lot, disappearing down the road. I was alone again. I sat back down on the weathered wooden bench, holding the burner phone in one hand and the pill bottle in the other. I needed to know exactly what weapon they were using against me. I opened the plastic cap of the pill bottle and carefully tipped one of the small white tablets into the palm of my hand. Without the prescription label, the medication was anonymous. But pharmaceutical companies leave distinct fingerprints. I held the tablet up to the sunlight, squinting to read the tiny alphanumeric code stamped into the compressed powder. I picked up the prepaid burner phone and opened the mobile web browser. My thumb moved quickly across the screen as I typed the alphanumeric code into a medical database. I pressed search and waited as the loading bar crawled across the top of the screen. The database results populated instantly. The screen displayed a high-resolution image of the tablet sitting in my palm. I read the chemical breakdown, the cold reality of their betrayal illuminating the screen. It was haloperidol. It was a severe antipsychotic medication typically administered in secure psychiatric wards to treat extreme cases of schizophrenia and acute delirium. The side effects included lethargy, cognitive impairment, memory loss, and a loss of motor function. Monica had been giving me concentrated doses of a chemical straitjacket. I scrolled down the page to read the standard prescription protocols. The drug was highly regulated. It could not be obtained legally without a strict diagnostic evaluation. I needed to know who had provided the weapon. I held the amber bottle up again, examining the torn remnants of the paper label. Most of the identifying information had been destroyed, but Monica had been careless near the bottom edge. A tiny sliver of white paper clung stubbornly to the plastic. I turned the bottle, angling it to catch the light. Printed in minuscule black ink, just barely legible, was the name of the prescribing physician, Dr. Gregory Pierce. I pocketed the amber pill bottle and the burner phone, leaving the weathered bench behind. The smoggy afternoon air felt heavy in my lungs, but my mind had never been clearer. I walked to the edge of the diner parking lot and hailed a passing cab, deciding an online ride service might leave a digital footprint tied directly to my primary tracking devices. I instructed the driver to take me to the industrial outskirts of Long Beach. I needed a medical facility that operated completely outside the standard corporate healthcare grid. I needed absolute discretion, and I needed unquestionable loyalty. My destination was a private medical clinic run by David Marshall. David was an old military surgeon I had served with decades ago, a man who owed me his entire professional practice after I bankrolled his clinic when the commercial banks flatly refused his business loans. He operated in a gray area, catering strictly to high-net-worth clients who required absolute anonymity. As the cab navigated the congested surface streets, I stared out the dirty passenger window. My own flesh and blood son. My own seemingly perfect daughter-in-law. They were not just ruthlessly stealing my hard-earned money. They were slowly, methodically erasing my very existence. The betrayal ran much deeper than simple greed. It was a cold, calculated assassination of my character. The cab pulled up to a nondescript, brutalist brick building nestled securely between two massive shipping warehouses. I paid the fare in crisp cash and stepped out into the humid, salty coastal air. I pushed through the heavy glass front doors and confidently bypassed the sparse waiting room, walking directly toward the secure clinical wing. The front desk receptionist stood up to loudly protest, but David stepped out of a nearby examination room. He was a tall, rugged man with a thick gray beard and sharp, perceptive eyes. He saw the cold, unyielding urgency clearly written in my expression and immediately waved off the worried receptionist. We entered his private back office, and I firmly locked the heavy wooden door behind us. I reached into my jacket, pulled out the amber pill bottle, and placed it directly on his stainless steel desk. I did not waste any time with polite pleasantries. I told him I needed a full expedited toxicology screen, and I needed it processed entirely off the official medical records. David took one long look at the bottle, read the remaining fragmented sliver of the label, and frowned deeply. He did not ask any unnecessary questions. He silently guided me to a leather examination chair, tied a rubber tourniquet tightly around my bicep, and expertly slid a needle into my prominent vein. I watched the dark crimson liquid flow steadily into the glass tubes, knowing that within those blood samples lay the irrefutable scientific proof of my family and their horrific treachery. As the dark red blood filled 3 separate collection vials, he promised me the final diagnostic results in less than an hour, using his advanced in-house laboratory equipment. With a small bandage securely taped over my arm, I sat completely alone in the quiet office. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the prepaid burner phone Rosa had provided. It was time to wake up the shark. I dialed the direct unlisted personal cellular number of Thomas Kensington. Thomas was my lead corporate attorney, a man who possessed a legal mind as ruthless and unforgiving as a rusted steel bear trap. He had spent the last 30 years aggressively protecting Alden Logistics from hostile corporate takeovers, industrial espionage, and predatory lawsuits. He answered on the very first ring. I quickly bypassed any standard friendly greeting. I told him I was calling from a secure, untraceable line and that my personal communications were highly likely to be fully compromised. Thomas immediately shifted into his aggressive battle mode, his voice dropping to a low, seriously focused register. I laid out the entire situation with absolute clinical precision. I explained the fake Chicago business trip, the 3 massive men in medical scrubs currently waiting inside my house, the heavy leather straitjacket, the forged superior court documents, and the slow, deliberate chemical poisoning. I heard a sharp, sudden intake of breath on the other end of the line. Thomas had known Bradley since my son was a small child, but in the brutal world of high-stakes, commercial logistics, sentimentality was a fatal, costly flaw. I gave Thomas his immediate, non-negotiable orders. I told him to initiate a code-red lockdown on every single financial and physical asset attached to my personal name. I wanted my private bank accounts completely frozen. I wanted my real estate deeds locked securely inside a blind holding trust. I wanted my massive stock portfolios suspended from any external trading. I explicitly instructed him to erect a legal fortress around my $60 million corporate empire that not even a wrecking ball could possibly breach. Thomas did not hesitate or pause for a single second. He promised that within the next 60 minutes, any desperate attempt by Bradley to access my wealth, execute a fraudulent power of attorney, or leverage my commercial properties would trigger a massive automated legal blockade. The trapdoors were finally slamming shut. I thanked Thomas, feeling a grim, powerful satisfaction replacing the lingering ache of parental heartbreak. I ended the call and I tossed the cheap burner phone onto the stainless steel desk. The trap was firmly set. Now I simply needed to confirm the exact chemical nature of the poison presently coursing through my veins. The passing minutes ticked by with agonizing, suffocating slowness. I paced the small, sterile office, my leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the polished linoleum floor. I thought about Monica smiling so sweetly as she handed me that poisoned morning coffee. I thought about Bradley standing confidently in my private study, eagerly waiting to steal my entire life. Finally, the heavy wooden door clicked loudly and pushed open. David walked slowly back into the softly lit room, nervously holding a freshly printed laboratory diagnostic report tightly in his large hands. His rugged face was visibly drawn, his skin shockingly pale, and his strong jaw clenched so tightly the muscles fluttered visibly under his gray beard. He did not look at me with the standard calm clinical detachment of a seasoned medical physician. He looked at me with the profound, terrified concern of a combat soldier who had just witnessed a brutal, calculated massacre. He slowly lowered the printed document onto the stainless steel desk, exhaling a long, shuddering breath before looking directly into my eyes. The blood work confirmed everything, but the reality was far more malicious than I had ever anticipated. David stated that my bloodstream contained massive, highly concentrated levels of the severe antipsychotic medication. The deliberate dosage they had been secretly feeding me was catastrophically high. He leaned forward, his voice trembling with a mixture of professional shock and personal outrage. He told me that if I had continued consuming those pills for just one more week, the accumulated chemical toxicity in my brain would have induced a permanent, irreversible coma. The execution was set. I thanked Dr. David with a quiet nod and walked out of the clinic. The oppressive coastal heat hit me instantly, but the cold reality of my situation kept my mind perfectly sharp. I did not bother looking back at the brick building. I walked 2 blocks down the road and flagged down a passing taxi. I told the driver to take me to the financial district in downtown Los Angeles, but I gave him an intersection 2 blocks away from my actual destination. I could not afford to leave a direct trail. The drive took 40 minutes. I spent every second staring out the window at the passing city. I thought about the logistics empire I had built from a single rusted truck. I thought about the thousands of employees who depended on my company to feed their families. Bradley was not just threatening my life. He was threatening the livelihoods of every single person under my corporate umbrella. The taxi pulled up to a busy intersection. I handed the driver a crisp $50 bill and stepped out onto the crowded sidewalk. I walked briskly, blending in with the afternoon rush of corporate professionals and eager tourists. I navigated the familiar streets until I reached a narrow, shadowed service alley, positioned directly behind an imposing glass and steel skyscraper. This was the headquarters of Kensington and Associates. I bypassed the grand front lobby entirely. I walked down the dim alleyway until I reached an unmarked heavy steel service door. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner concealed beneath a weatherproof cover. The locking mechanism clicked open instantly, recognizing my print. I stepped into a quiet service corridor and took the private elevator directly to the top floor. The elevator doors slid open, revealing the vast, silent expanse of Thomas Kensington and his private office suite. Thomas was already standing behind his massive oak desk. His sleeves were rolled up and his tie was loosened. The seasoned corporate lawyer looked like a general preparing for a brutal siege. 3 of his top forensic accountants were sitting at a long conference table surrounded by glowing monitors and thick stacks of digital printouts. They did not look up when I walked into the room. Their eyes were locked entirely on the scrolling data of my life and my work. Thomas walked over and firmly shook my hand. He did not waste time asking how I felt about the poison in my blood. He knew I was already focused entirely on the counterattack. I asked him what his team had found inside the corporate servers. Thomas guided me to the head of the conference table. He explained that initiating the financial lockdown had triggered a series of automated security protocols across the company network. Bradley had been using his newly acquired executive access to systematically dismantle the financial safeguards I had spent decades implementing. Thomas instructed his lead accountant to initiate a stealth forensic audit. This was a highly advanced tracing protocol designed to bypass standard corporate firewalls without alerting the primary system administrators. We needed to see exactly how deep the rot went without letting Bradley know we were looking. The accountant typed a rapid sequence of commands into his keyboard. The large wall-mounted presentation screen flickered to life. Columns of raw financial data began to cascade down the monitor, illuminating the dark room with a pale blue glow. I stood perfectly still, watching the digital lifeblood of Alden Logistics flash before my eyes. For the first 20 minutes, the ledgers appeared completely normal. The standard operating expenses, the payroll distributions, the fuel costs, and the routine maintenance budgets all matched my internal projections. Bradley had been careful. He had expertly buried his illicit activities deep beneath layers of legitimate corporate transactions. But a stealth audit is designed to find the invisible cracks in the foundation. The lead forensic accountant suddenly paused the scrolling data. He highlighted a complex web of recent real estate transactions. My chest tightened as I read the corporate designations on the screen. Bradley had not simply embezzled liquid cash from the operational accounts. He had committed a far more catastrophic financial crime. Using the forged executive authority Monica had helped him secure, he had secretly leveraged 4 of my largest distribution warehouses as collateral. These were the primary shipping hubs located in Chicago, Dallas, Atlanta, and Seattle. They were the physical pillars holding up my entire national supply chain. Bradley had quietly transferred the property titles into a newly created subsidiary holding company. He then used those titles to secure massive, unregulated commercial loans from private shadow lenders. He was mortgaging the very concrete and steel of my legacy to fund his desperate agenda. Thomas let out a low, angry breath. He explained that these loans were structured with predatory interest rates and hidden default clauses. If the massive debt was not settled, the private lenders would legally seize the warehouses, effectively crippling the operational capacity of Alden Logistics overnight. I asked the forensic accountant to trace the exact destination of the borrowed funds. I needed to know exactly who was holding the leash around my son and his wife. The accountant initiated a deep web tracking sequence following the digital money trail through a dizzying maze of offshore accounts and blind trusts. The massive funds had bounced from the Cayman Islands to Panama, and finally to a remote banking server located somewhere deep within the Caribbean. The digital laundering technique was incredibly sophisticated, clearly indicating that Bradley was not acting alone in this endeavor. He was being guided by highly trained individuals who specialized entirely in making massive illicit fortunes completely disappear without a single trace. The tracking software finally isolated the terminal destination of the diverted funds. The lead accountant stopped typing on the glowing keyboard and slowly looked up at Thomas. The spacious room fell into absolute suffocating silence. Thomas placed his hands flat on the conference table and leaned heavily over the wooden surface. He stared silently at the screen for a long, agonizing moment. He then slowly reached out his right arm and turned the large presentation monitor around so it faced me directly. I looked closely at the highlighted final destination. The money had been funneled directly into a massive shell corporation based completely out of Miami. I recognized the corporate entity immediately. It was a well-known, highly insulated financial front for a ruthless international crime syndicate. Bradley had not just stolen money from his trusting family. He had climbed foolishly into bed with a dangerous cartel. Thomas looked at me with cold, unblinking eyes. He pointed a finger to the digital ledger displayed clearly on the monitor. He explained that my son had borrowed exactly $15 million from the powerful syndicate. He pointed downward to a secondary file detailing the aggressive loan terms. The brutal, inescapable reality of the dire situation finally settled heavily over the utterly silent room. Bradley had not just stolen massive amounts of company money, he owed $15 million to a cartel, and the absolute final deadline for the full repayment was strictly due in exactly 48 short hours. The massive $15 million cartel debt extinguished my remaining paternal sentiment. Bradley was a desperate, cornered animal, thrashing wildly to save his own life, entirely willing to sacrifice me. I left Thomas in his office issuing a strict directive to maintain radio silence. I hailed a cab back to the mall where I had abandoned my vehicle. I found my dark luxury sedan exactly where I parked it. The tracking beacon was still secured to the undercarriage, silently broadcasting my location to my executioners. I slowly slid into the leather driver's seat and firmly gripped the steering wheel, taking a long, slow, incredibly measured breath. The critical time for quietly gathering actionable intelligence was completely over. It was finally time to step bravely and directly into the merciless jaws of the elaborate trap they had so carefully laid for me. I smoothly put the car in gear and confidently began the long, quiet drive back to my sprawling residential estate. During that solitary drive, I systematically and deliberately stripped away the rigid, commanding posture of a highly successful, remarkably formidable chief executive. I intentionally let my broad shoulders slump weakly forward physically, rounding my spine to perfectly mimic the heavy, invisible, crushing weight of advanced age. I diligently practiced softening my sharp gaze successfully, replacing my usually calculating, intense focus with a remarkably dull, vacant, and aimless wandering stare. I completely had to become the frail, broken man they so desperately needed me to be. I had to flawlessly become the pathetic, entirely incompetent victim. Just before turning the heavy vehicle onto my quiet, secluded private street, I deliberately reached over into the passenger side glove compartment and carefully retrieved a flat, highly polished, stainless steel drinking flask. I quickly unscrewed the tight metal cap, unceremoniously emptied the remaining stale whiskey directly out the open car window, and then strategically tucked the empty concealed flask securely into the deep, hidden inner breast pocket of my tailored designer suit jacket. I slowly turned the steering wheel and gently guided the large sedan down the incredibly long, beautifully landscaped, winding driveway of my primary estate. The entire sprawling property was deeply, unsettlingly quiet. The fake emergency plumbing vans Monica had specifically mentioned on the phone were now completely and conspicuously absent from the circular driveway. They had very clearly and intentionally moved their intrusive utility vehicles directly into the expansive, closed, multi-car garage to perfectly maintain the deceptive illusion of a totally peaceful, entirely empty family home. I parked the car right near the grand front entrance, quietly turned off the humming engine, and took one final, incredibly deep breath. I intentionally let my tight jaw go slightly slack. I opened the heavy car door and carefully stepped out, deliberately and noisily, dragging the hard heel of my right leather shoe against the decorative paving stones. I clumsily shuffled up the long stone pathway, consciously making my physical movements agonizingly slow and tremendously labored. I reached the heavy oak front door and fumbled clumsily with my metal house keys, purposely dropping the entire loud ring completely onto the textured, woven welcome mat. I bent my body down, very slowly, groaning loudly, with wildly exaggerated physical effort, before finally unlocking the large door and pushing it heavily open. The grand entryway foyer was warmly bathed in the rich golden fading light of the late afternoon, but the unnatural silence inside the house itself felt incredibly thick and suffocatingly heavy, actively charged with an electric, deeply predatory tension. I stepped clumsily inside the quiet house, deliberately leaving my expensive leather briefcase sitting abandoned on the marble floor, and aggressively rubbed my temples as if actively fighting off a sudden, overwhelmingly disorienting wave of deep mental confusion. Right on absolute perfect cue, the rapid, sharp clicking of designer high heels loudly echoed from the adjacent hallway. Monica suddenly appeared wearing a soft, casual pastel cardigan and a bright look of absolute, perfectly manufactured, sickeningly fake devotion. Her wide, dark eyes immediately widened further, with deeply practiced, entirely artificial concern, as she enthusiastically hurried across the shiny marble floor to warmly greet me. "Richard," she said aloud, her soft voice heavily dripping with sugary, completely artificial saccharine warmth. "You are home incredibly late. We were actually starting to get so very deeply worried about you." She quickly reached out and gently took my frail right arm. Her touch, which I once found comforting, now felt like the clinical grip of a venomous snake. "Traffic was terrible," I mumbled, slurring my words slightly, letting my head loll toward my chest. "I feel so tired, Monica. So incredibly tired. My head is spinning again. I just cannot seem to shake this fog today." "Oh, you poor thing," she cooed, stroking my arm with maternal condescension. "You have been pushing yourself much too hard lately. The plumbers just finished packing up their equipment. I told Bradley to go wait in the guest house so the house would be quiet for you. Come sit down in the living room. Let me get you something warm to drink." I allowed her to lead me to the leather armchair. I sank into the cushions with a weary sigh. Monica hovered over me, her eyes darting quickly to gauge my alertness before gliding toward the kitchen. I sat perfectly still, listening to the clinking of ceramic. She was preparing the final dose to incapacitate me so the extraction team could secure the straitjacket. She returned carrying a silver tray with a steaming porcelain teacup. She placed it on the coffee table and picked up the cup. "I made you a special chamomile blend," she whispered, smiling with chilling sweetness. "It will clear that brain fog. Drink it while it is hot, Richard." I reached out with trembling hands and took the cup. Underneath the chamomile, I detected a faint, bitter chemical undertone. The haloperidol. It was a massive, paralyzing dose. "Thank you, Monica," I rasped, bringing the cup close to my lips. Before the liquid touched my mouth, a loud, sharp knocking echoed from the heavy front door. Monica stiffened. A flash of genuine panic cracked her perfect facade. She had not anticipated an interruption, No one was supposed to be at the door. "I will be right back," she hissed. "Drink your tea." She marched toward the entryway. The moment her back disappeared, my trembling hands became steady. I pulled the stainless steel flask from my breast pocket, uncapped it, and poured the hot, chemically laced tea into the metal container. I screwed the cap back on, slid the flask seamlessly into my jacket, and set the empty cup onto the tray. I waited exactly 10 seconds. I let out a loud groan and threw my weight forcefully to the side, knocking the silver tray off the table. It hit the hardwood floor with a deafening crash. Monica rushed frantically back into the room. She found me slumped dangerously sideways in the armchair, my eyes rolling upward. "Richard!" She gasped, a triumphant, predatory smile forming on her lips. She grabbed my shoulders, her grip tight and eager. "Let me help you, Richard. Let me help you to your bedroom." The grip Monica had on my arms was surprisingly strong. She hauled me up from the armchair, her breathing hitched, with a frantic, eager energy. I let my legs drag, playing the part of the heavily sedated, failing old man. I moaned incoherently, letting my chin rest heavily against my chest as she practically dragged me down the long, shadowed hallway toward the master bedroom. She pushed me onto the mattress, not bothering to remove my shoes or pull back the expensive silk sheets. I let my body collapse into a limp, lifeless pile. Monica stood over me for a long, agonizing minute. I kept my breathing shallow, my eyes rolled back behind half-closed lids, waiting in the stillness. Finally, I heard a sharp, satisfied exhale escape her lips. She turned off the bedside lamp, walked out of the room, and pulled the heavy door shut. A solid, metallic click echoed through the darkness. She had locked me inside from the outside. I lay perfectly motionless in the pitch-black room for exactly 2 hours. The ambient sounds of the massive estate slowly shifted as night fell over Los Angeles. The distant hum of the freeway faded into a quiet, rhythmic murmur. At 8 sharp, the distinct crunch of tires on the gravel driveway signaled the arrival of a vehicle. The heavy front door opened and closed. I heard the muffled, low-pitched baritone of my son echoing from the kitchen directly below my bedroom. Bradley had returned. He was likely confirming the extraction plan, with Monica coordinating the final steps with the medical team they had hidden in the garage. They believed they had effectively neutralized their primary obstacle. They believed I was currently floating in a deep, chemically induced void, completely oblivious to the theft of my empire. I opened my eyes. The darkness was absolute, but I did not need light to navigate the house I had built from the ground up. Every creaking floorboard, every structural quirk, every hidden mechanism was mapped perfectly in my mind. I sat up smoothly, my mind sharp and unclouded by the poison they thought they had administered. I slipped my shoes off, setting them gently on the thick carpet. I walked silently over to the master bathroom, bypassing the locked bedroom door entirely. When we renovated the estate 10 years ago, I had insisted on installing a discreet secondary egress route from the master suite to the lower levels, a paranoid but highly practical security measure for a man in my position. I pushed open the concealed panel behind the large white linen closet and stepped into the narrow service corridor. I descended the steep wooden stairs in total silence, moving like a ghost through the very walls of my own home. I bypassed the kitchen where the low hum of the hushed conversation between Bradley and his wife continued to vibrate through the floorboards. I moved with deliberate, calculating precision, slipping seamlessly into the west wing of the estate. This section housed the private home offices. I bypassed my own heavily secured study and moved directly toward the modern glass-walled office Bradley had commandeered for himself. The door was closed but unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room smelled of expensive cologne and anxiety. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the moonlight. I moved behind his pristine mahogany desk. Bradley was an arrogant man, but he was also incredibly careless. He relied heavily on the superficial security of his gated community and the false loyalty of his accomplices. Resting directly in the center of the desk, plugged into a sleek charging dock, was his personal tablet. The screen was dark, but a small green indicator light pulsed softly. I reached out and tapped the glass. The screen flared to life, illuminating the dark room with a pale bluish glow. Bradley had not bothered to engage the biometric lock or set a complex numerical password. He was so confident in his total control over the household that he had simply left the device open and entirely vulnerable. I swiped my finger upward, instantly bypassing the lock screen and accessing the main dashboard. I immediately opened his primary document application, scanning the recently accessed files. My eyes locked onto a folder labeled with my full legal name. I opened the digital folder and tapped the first document in the queue. The screen filled with densely packed legal text, complete with the official seals and authorized signatures of the Superior Court. It was a fully finalized petition for an emergency medical conservatorship. The clinical language was cold, detached, and entirely damning. The petition falsely declared that I had suffered a catastrophic, unrecoverable cognitive collapse. It cited fabricated medical evaluations, entirely fake diagnostic reports, and the highly manipulated testimony of my own family. The documents legally certified that I was mentally brain-dead, completely incapable of making rational decisions, and utterly dependent on constant, heavily sedated psychiatric care. The final page of the digital document contained a grim, terrifying timeline. The emergency judicial order was scheduled to be officially executed and legally ratified at exactly 8 in the morning tomorrow. In less than 12 hours, the extraction team currently hiding in my garage would strap me into a heavy leather straitjacket, transport me to an undisclosed, highly secure facility, and Bradley would assume absolute, unchecked legal authority over the entirety of Alden Logistics and my $60 million fortune. The flawless legal execution of my identity was perfectly coordinated. I quickly pulled a small, high-capacity encrypted flash drive from my inner jacket pocket, plugged it directly into the side port of the tablet, and initiated a rapid, silent transfer of the entire document folder. I needed every single forged signature and fake medical report securely stored as irrefutable physical evidence. As the blue progress bar crawled across the illuminated screen, my eyes scanned the other applications installed on the tablet. Nestled discreetly in the corner of the digital display, disguised with a generic icon resembling a simple weather application, was a highly secure, heavily encrypted messaging platform. It was the exact type of untraceable communication software favored by organized crime syndicates and shadow financiers to avoid federal surveillance. The file transfer completed with a soft, almost imperceptible chime. I pulled the flash drive free and tapped the disguised messaging icon. The application opened, revealing a single active communication thread. The sender was completely anonymous, identified only by a randomized string of chaotic alphanumeric characters. I opened the active thread and read the most recent incoming message. The text was short, brutally direct, and chillingly clear. It read, "If the old man does not sign the transfer by Friday night, we take your wife and we take your life." I stared at the glowing screen, feeling an icy current of absolute clarity wash over my mind. The cartel was incredibly serious. Bradley was trapped in a lethal corner. He needed my immediate elimination to access the massive corporate funds and save his own pathetic existence. The high stakes were completely unmasked, and the true desperate motive behind his merciless betrayal was undeniably exposed here this evening. The dawn broke over the sprawling Los Angeles estate with a deceptive, tranquil beauty. Sunlight filtered through the heavy silk drapes of my bedroom, casting long golden shadows across the thick carpet. I had spent the remaining hours of the night sitting completely still in the dark, my mind churning through the horrifying revelation I had discovered on my Sun tablet. $15 million owed to a ruthless Miami syndicate, a death threat hanging directly over his head and the head of his treacherous wife. Bradley was not a criminal mastermind. He was a terrified, desperate boy playing a dangerous game with men who would not hesitate to kill him. And to save his own skin, he was entirely willing to sacrifice me, his own father, locking me in a psychiatric ward to steal the funds necessary to pay off his lethal debts. I slowly rose from the edge of the mattress, my muscles stiff from the tension of the night. It was time to give them the performance they were so desperately waiting for. I walked into the adjoining master bathroom and looked closely at my reflection in the expansive mirror. I needed to look like a man whose cognitive functions were rapidly, catastrophically shutting down. I aggressively rubbed my hands over my face, pulling the skin downward to accentuate the deep wrinkles and heavy bags under my eyes. I intentionally ruffled my gray hair, leaving it looking unkempt and neglected. I practiced a vacant, uncomprehending stare, letting the sharp, calculating light fade entirely from my eyes. I let my shoulders slump forward, rounding my spine to mimic the crushing physical burden of advanced, debilitating dementia. I unlocked the bedroom door with a soft, metallic click and stepped out into the long, quiet hallway. I began my slow, agonizing shuffle toward the kitchen. I dragged my leather slippers heavily against the polished hardwood floor, making sure every single step was loud, clumsy, and completely uncoordinated. I let out a low, confused moan, a sound of profound disorientation, as I approached the grand archway leading into the kitchen. Bradley and Monica were already there. They were standing near the massive marble island, speaking in urgent, hushed whispers. The moment my dragging footsteps echoed into the room, their conversation abruptly stopped. I paused in the doorway, swaying slightly on my feet, blinking rapidly against the bright morning light, as if it were deeply painful to process. I watched them through my half-closed, wandering eyes. The sheer, unfiltered disgust radiating from my son was palpable. He looked at me not with the loving concern of a child watching his father decline, but with the cold, impatient annoyance of a man waiting for a stubborn obstacle to finally collapse. Monica Ever, the dedicated actress, instantly smoothed her features into a mask of sweet, patronizing sympathy. "Good morning, Richard," she said, her voice dripping with that familiar saccharine poison. She quickly walked over and gently took me by the elbow, guiding my supposedly fragile body toward a tall bar stool at the kitchen island. "Did you sleep well? You look terribly exhausted today." I let my head bob loosely on my neck, my jaw hanging slightly slack. "I cannot remember," I mumbled, forcing my voice to sound incredibly raspy and incredibly weak. "The walls are so bright. Everything is so confusing today. Where is Rosa? Why is the house so quiet?" Rosa had a family emergency. Richard, Monica lied, smoothly, expertly pulling out the heavy wooden stool for me. "She had to leave suddenly. But do not worry about a thing. I am right here to take care of you. I have your special morning coffee already prepared." She slid a steaming ceramic mug across the smooth marble surface. I stared down at the dark liquid, knowing exactly what heavy mind-altering chemical she had crushed and stirred into the brew. My hands began to tremble with a violent, dramatic tremor as I slowly reached out to grasp the warm ceramic handle. I purposefully misjudged the distance, my shaking fingers colliding with the side of the mug. A small wave of hot coffee sloshed over the rim, spilling onto the pristine white marble countertop. "Oh, be careful," Richard, Monica scolded gently, grabbing a linen towel to wipe up the brown stain. Her eyes darted quickly to Bradley, sharing a triumphant, silent exchange. They believed the massive dose from the previous evening was fully taking hold. They believed my brain was rapidly turning into useless, compliant mush, while Monica was distracted with the spilled liquid, and Bradley was anxiously checking the glowing screen of his expensive wristwatch. I seamlessly slipped my left hand into the deep pocket of my thick wool cardigan. My fingers quickly found the small prepaid burner phone Rosa had given me in the diner parking lot. My thumb moved expertly over the tactile keypad, relying entirely on muscle memory. I had drafted the critical text message hours ago, leaving it sitting securely in the outbox, waiting for this exact, definitive moment. The message contained a single, highly encrypted code word. It was the absolute final authorization for Thomas Kensington, my ruthless corporate attorney, to initiate the ultimate defensive protocol. It was the nuclear option. I pressed the send button with a firm, decisive push of my thumb. I felt the tiny vibration of the device confirming the message had successfully transmitted through the secure cellular network. Deep within the steel and glass fortress of his downtown law firm, Thomas was currently executing a complex, impenetrable financial maneuver known as an irrevocable blind Swiss trust. With a few rapid keystrokes, Thomas was actively legally transferring 100% of my massive liquid assets, my vast investment portfolios, and my controlling shares of Alden Logistics entirely out of my personal name. The sheer brilliance of the irrevocable trust was its absolute permanence. Once the aggressive legal transfer was officially initiated, the massive fortune ceased to be my personal property. It was instantly locked behind an impenetrable wall of international banking privacy laws, managed entirely by anonymous Swiss trustees. Even I could not legally touch the money without a complex, multi-year judicial review. By initiating this extreme measure, I was deliberately stripping myself of all my worldly wealth. I was making myself completely, entirely bankrupt on paper. But more importantly, I was making the emergency conservatorship completely worthless. When Bradley arrived at the courthouse tomorrow morning, with his fake medical documents legally declaring me mentally brain-dead, he would gladly win complete control over my estate. But he would quickly discover that the estate he had fought so hard to steal was completely and utterly empty. He was fighting violently for the keys to a bank vault that held absolutely nothing but dust. I let out a long, heavy sigh, resting my forehead against the cool marble of the kitchen island, continuing my pathetic performance. "I am so tired," I whispered, letting my eyes drift shut. "So very tired." "You just rest right there, Dad." Bradley finally spoke, his voice tense and vibrating with poorly concealed anxiety. "Just close your eyes and relax. We have everything completely under control." I kept my eyes shut, listening intently to the subtle, revealing sounds of the room. I could hear Bradley pacing restlessly back and forth across the hardwood floor. His heavy leather shoes clicked erratically, betraying the sheer, suffocating terror currently gripping his heart. The ruthless Miami syndicate had given him a strict, non-negotiable deadline. He needed to execute a massive wire transfer today to appease the violent men who were threatening to murder him and his wife. I heard the distinct, soft rustle of expensive fabric as Bradley pulled his slim silver laptop from his leather briefcase. I heard the rapid, frantic tapping of his fingers striking the digital keyboard. He was logging into the primary corporate banking portal using the executive access credentials he had deceitfully obtained. He was initiating the first crucial payment to the cartel. $5 million quietly routed through a complex maze of offshore shell companies. I waited in the tense, heavy silence, my heart beating with cold, predatory anticipation. I knew exactly what was about to happen. Thomas had promised that the financial lockdown would be immediate and absolute. A sharp, bright electronic chime suddenly shattered the quiet atmosphere of the kitchen. I slowly opened one eye, peering through my messy, unkempt gray hair. Bradley was staring down at the glowing screen of his laptop. All the color had instantly and completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, terrifying shade of pale white. His mouth hung open, his breathing suddenly shallow and rapid. He looked like a man who had just watched his own execution order being signed. "What is it?" "Bradley," Monica asked, her sweet, fake tone dropping immediately into a sharp, worried hiss. "What is wrong with the computer?" Bradley did not answer her. He could not answer her. His trembling fingers reached out and frantically tapped the trackpad, trying desperately to refresh the digital banking portal, trying to erase the devastating error message flashing brightly across the center of his screen. But the brutal, unyielding reality of the financial blockade refused to disappear. The massive $5 million international wire transfer had been violently rejected by the banking servers. The digital notification glowing ominously on the screen was incredibly clear and incredibly final. The message read, "Account frozen. Access denied. Authorized signatory only. Please contact legal department." The heavy, invisible trap I had spent the entire night building had just slammed violently shut around his neck. The money was entirely gone, the cartel deadline was rapidly approaching, and my treacherous son was finally, completely, entirely out of time. The true unyielding power of a father who had built an empire from absolutely nothing was now descending upon him with the merciless, unstoppable force of a collapsing mountain. He was entirely trapped in a cage of his own creation. Bradley sat frozen, his eyes wide and unblinking, as the digital error message burned into the retina of his eyes. The absolute silence in the kitchen was heavy thick with the sudden realization that his flawless plan had just hit an impenetrable brick wall. I knew this was my only window of opportunity. While his mind was completely consumed by the sudden financial catastrophe, I let out a loud, shuddering breath and purposely let my upper body sway violently to the left. I reached out with a trembling hand, grabbing the thick edge of the marble island to steady my intentionally clumsy movements. Monica instantly turned her head, her attention momentarily ripped away from the glowing screen. She rushed forward, grabbing my shoulder to prevent me from collapsing onto the hardwood floor. In that brief, chaotic moment of highly manufactured physical distress, my right hand slid smoothly under the overhanging lip of the kitchen counter. My fingers pressed a small, magnetic audio transmitter firmly against the cold stone. Thomas had handed me the military-grade listening device just before I left his office, anticipating that I would need to monitor their private conversations. The tiny device clicked silently into place, completely hidden from view. I groaned loudly, letting my chin fall against my chest, playing the part of the heavily sedated, broken old man. Monica sighed in sheer frustration, her grip on my arm tightening painfully. She barked an order at Bradley, telling him to figure out the computer issue while she put me to bed. Bradley did not even look up. He remained completely paralyzed, staring at the frozen banking portal. Monica practically dragged me down the long, shadowed hallway. She shoved me roughly into the master bedroom, not bothering with the saccharine, sweet tone she had used earlier. The facade was crumbling. She threw a heavy quilt over my legs, turned off the bedside lamp, and walked out without a single word of comfort. I heard the heavy metallic click of the lock securing the door from the outside. The moment her footsteps faded down the corridor, I threw off the blanket and sat up in the pitch-black room. My mind was sharp-focused and entirely clear. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and retrieved the burner phone. I opened the encrypted audio application and synced it directly to the transmitter I had just secured beneath the marble island. A low, rhythmic burst of static hissed softly from the phone speaker before the audio connection stabilized. The ambient sounds of my kitchen flooded into the quiet bedroom with crystal-clear precision. I adjusted the volume, pressing the small device closely against my ear. The audio feed captured the sound of Bradley breathing heavily, his inhalations sharp and incredibly erratic. He was hyperventilating. Monica marched back into the kitchen, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the floorboards. She demanded to know what was wrong with the laptop. Bradley tried to speak, but his voice was completely choked with blind terror. He finally managed to stammer out the horrific reality of his situation. He told her the primary accounts were entirely frozen. He frantically explained the concept of an irrevocable blind trust, describing how the millions of dollars they desperately needed had vanished into a legally impenetrable fortress. He told her he was completely locked out. Monica let out a sharp, breathless gasp. The absolute gravity of the situation was finally crashing down upon them. They had spent months carefully orchestrating my mental decline, hiring fraudulent doctors and preparing fake legal documents, all under the strict assumption that the money would be waiting for this simpon at the finish line. Now the vault was utterly empty. The silence that followed was heavy with a suffocating, undeniable panic. Bradley began to unravel completely. His voice pitched upward, vibrating with pure cowardice. He started pacing wildly around the kitchen island. He told Monica they had to leave immediately. He frantically suggested that they empty their personal checking accounts, pack their most expensive jewelry, and drive straight to the airport. He desperately wanted to book a private charter flight to a country completely outside of federal extradition treaties. He babbled about hiding in South America, about changing their identities, about abandoning the massive estate, and running for their miserable lives. He was terrified of the cartel. He knew the violent, merciless nature of the men who had loaned him $15 million. He wept openly, begging his wife to understand that they were out of time. If they stayed in Los Angeles, the Shadow Syndicate would send their executioners to collect the debt in blood. His pathetic weeping pleas echoed through the audio feed, exposing the absolute weakness of the boy I had raised. He had desired the wealth and power of an empire, but he possessed none of the iron will required to actually defend it. He was a small, fragile creature, caught entirely in a trap meant for apex predators. A sudden, incredibly loud crack echoed through the speaker of the burner phone. It was the sharp, unmistakable sound of an open hand violently striking human flesh. Bradley let out a startled, pathetic whimper. Monica had slapped him directly across the face. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was utterly devoid of the sweet, high-pitched warmth she usually maintained. It was low, guttural, and trembling, with an intense, unyielding, absolute rage. She told him to shut his pathetic mouth and stop acting like a terrified child. She viciously mocked his plan to run away, reminding him that the cartel had eyes inside the airports, inside the banks, and inside their own neighborhood. She told him that running would only guarantee their immediate violent deaths. Monica was not a coward. She was a ruthless, calculating survivor, and she was entirely prepared to cross any moral or legal boundary to save her own skin. She stepped closer to the audio transmitter, her furious voice dropping to a harsh, commanding whisper. She told Bradley that the only way to access the locked funds was to establish undeniable legal physical control over me before the trust administrators could finalize the transfer protocols. She outlined a new, incredibly brutal contingency plan. The forged conservatorship papers required a physical signature or a biometric thumbprint to expedite the immediate release of emergency medical funds. Monica ordered Bradley to pick up his phone and immediately call Dr. Gregory Pierce. She commanded him to bring the corrupt physician and the heavy extraction team directly to the house tonight. They were no longer going to wait for the morning. They were no longer going to play a slow, careful game of medical deception. They were going to forcefully extract the biological authorization they needed. Bradley stammered weakly, protesting that bringing the team in the middle of the night was too dangerous, that it might alert the private neighborhood security patrols. Monica viciously cut him off. Her tone was absolute ice. She snarled into the quiet kitchen, her words perfectly captured by the hidden transmitter. "If you do not get his print tonight, the cartel will skin you alive. Bring the damn doctor. We will use the heavy, lethal dose." The heavy silence that followed Monica's chilling command was broken only by the sound of Bradley's ragged, defeated breathing. He did not argue. He did not attempt to defend himself or offer an alternative solution. He was a thoroughly broken man, entirely consumed by the paralyzing terror of the violent men he had foolishly brought into our lives. I listened through the hidden audio transmitter as he offered a weak, trembling murmur of compliance. The sharp, rapid clicking of his dress shoes echoed across the hardwood floor as he hurriedly walked toward the front of the estate. The heavy oak door opened with a dull creak and slammed shut, sending a faint vibration through the floorboards of my pitch-black bedroom. A few moments later, the distinct muted roar of his sports car engine ignited in the driveway. The sound of crunching gravel faded into the distance as he sped away into the Los Angeles night, racing to retrieve the corrupt physician and the heavy extraction team. I lay perfectly still on my mattress, staring up at the invisible ceiling. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating. Bradley was gone, but the true threat remained inside the house. I pressed the burner phone closer to my ear, focusing entirely on the ambient noises transmitting from the kitchen. With my son out of the room, the chaotic, panicked energy that had completely filled the space just moments ago instantly evaporated. The frantic pacing ceased. The erratic, shallow breathing stopped. Monica was entirely alone, and the sudden shift in her physical demeanor was deeply terrifying to witness through the audio feed. She did not weep. She did not pace. She did not exhibit a single ounce of the desperate, frantic anxiety that had just crippled her husband. Instead, I heard the calm, deliberate sound of high heels stepping slowly toward the custom wet bar. I heard the sharp, crystalline clinking of ice cubes dropping into a heavy glass. I heard the smooth, steady pouring of an expensive liquor. She was pouring herself a drink. She was completely, entirely relaxed. The performance was over, and the mask had been discarded. I listened to the slow, rhythmic tapping of her manicured fingernails against the marble island. She was waiting. A few seconds later, the distinct sequence of numbers being dialed echoed through the speaker. She was initiating a phone call. It was not to Bradley, and it was certainly not to Dr. Gregory Pierce. The line rang twice before a deep, resonant, impossibly cold voice answered. The man did not offer a greeting. He simply breathed into the receiver, waiting for her to speak. "I have an update regarding the internal situation at the estate," Monica said. Her voice was unrecognizable. The sweet, melodic pitch she used to manipulate my son was completely gone. In its place was a flat, authoritative, chillingly detached tone. She sounded like a seasoned corporate mercenary, delivering a routine situational report. The man on the other end of the line grunted softly. "The deadline remains absolute," he replied, his words laced with a quiet, terrifying menace. "Your husband failed to process the international wire transfer this afternoon. The financial accounts are entirely locked down. Our employers are growing incredibly impatient with these constant amateur delays. We require the $15 million immediately, or we will initiate the physical collection protocols. You know exactly what that entails." "I am fully aware of the current financial blockade," Monica replied smoothly, completely unfazed by the explicit threat of cartel violence. Taking a slow, measured sip of her drink, she continued. "Bradley is a weak, incompetent fool. He completely panicked when the banking portal rejected the transaction. He lacks the necessary nerve to handle a high-stakes operational failure. But you do not need to worry about the primary deadline. The situation with the old man is currently being neutralized. He is heavily sedated, completely incapacitated, and locked securely inside the master bedroom. Bradley is currently retrieving the private medical extraction team. We will forcefully obtain the biological thumbprint authorization tonight. The irrevocable trust will be legally broken before sunrise, and the digital funds will be fully available for transfer by tomorrow morning." There was a brief calculating silence on the phone line. The cartel enforcer let out a low, rumbling hum of approval. "That is acceptable," he finally stated. "But the severe penalty for your husband's initial failure remains active. He embarrassed our employers. He demonstrated severe operational weakness. We cannot simply overlook his utter lack of professional discipline. The original terms of our arrangement have fundamentally changed." "I know," Monica replied, her voice remaining perfectly steady. "And I have anticipated this necessary adjustment. That is exactly why I am calling you on this secure channel. We need to finalize the secondary operational parameters we discussed last month." I gripped the burner phone tightly, my knuckles turning white in the darkness. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the sheer scale of the deception unfolding in my kitchen. Monica had not just been an eager accomplice in Bradley's foolish scheme. She had been independently negotiating with the shadow syndicate behind his back. She had orchestrated a completely separate, highly classified arrangement with the very men who were threatening to murder them. "I am listening," the enforcer replied quietly. Monica set her glass down on the marble counter. "Bradley has become a massive, unpredictable liability," she stated coldly, speaking about her husband with the casual, detached indifference of a butcher examining a piece of meat. "His mounting paranoia and absolute cowardice are going to jeopardize the entire financial extraction. He is unstable, and I can no longer guarantee his absolute silence if the federal authorities begin to investigate the massive corporate transfer. He will undoubtedly confess to save his own skin, and he will eagerly drag both of us down with him. He has served his temporary purpose, but his continued existence is now a direct threat to our mutual success." "What exactly are you proposing?" the deep voice asked. I am proposing a permanent mutually beneficial solution, Monica said smoothly, without a single shred of hesitation or remorse. The biological authorization will be completely secured tonight. The heavy funds will be legally unspooled from the blind trust and fully transferred into the primary corporate accounts by tomorrow morning. I will personally ensure that your initial $15 million debt is wired directly to your offshore holding servers without any further delays. But I want you to execute the secondary phase immediately after the digital wire clears. I held my breath, feeling a freezing, profound chill radiate through my veins. The woman I had welcomed into my home, the woman I had trusted to care for my family, was calmly requesting a professional assassination. Monica leaned closer to her cellular device, her voice dropping into a harsh, venomous whisper. Bradley is failing. When the transfer clears tomorrow, take him out. Make it look like a suicide. I will inherit the rest as the grieving widow, and your cartel gets an extra $10 million. I realized my son was a fool, but my own daughter-in-law was a truly magnificent monster. I sat perfectly still on the edge of the mattress, the cold plastic of the burner phone pressed firmly against my ear. The magnitude of Monica's secret phone call echoed through the dark, quiet bedroom. She had seamlessly orchestrated an assassination plot against her own husband, negotiating his impending murder with the cold, calculating precision of a corporate merger. Bradley was entirely oblivious, desperately racing out into the night to gather the medical extraction team, completely unaware that his beloved wife had just effectively signed his death warrant. He believed he was fighting to secure a stolen fortune, but he was merely a temporary pawn in her elaborate, incredibly lethal game. My son was a tragic, pathetic fool, but the woman he married was a highly dangerous apex predator. I slowly lowered the phone, letting the crushing reality of the situation harden my resolve. There was no longer any room for paternal hesitation. The final shreds of my fatherly mercy evaporated into the dark, suffocating air of the master suite. It was time to completely turn the tables. I stood up and moved silently through the blacked-out room, my mind executing tactical preparations with absolute clarity. I carefully stripped the heavy quilt and silk sheets from the mattress, folding them meticulously to ensure the bed appeared completely, undeniably empty. I did not want them to simply glance inside. I needed them to walk fully inside, drawn deep into the trap by their own confusion. I moved to the master bathroom, leaving the door slightly ajar to create a deceptive shadow, and positioned myself perfectly behind the thick, solid wood of the primary entry doors. I checked the heavy brass locking mechanism, ensuring the deadbolt was perfectly aligned to slide effortlessly into the reinforced doorframe the moment I triggered the release. The hours dragged by with agonizing slowness. I stood in the absolute darkness, controlling my breathing, lowering my heart rate until my chest barely moved. The sprawling estate remained unsettlingly quiet, the silence broken only by the distant rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway. As the glowing digital numbers on my wristwatch shifted to exactly 10 in the evening, the deep mechanical rumble of a heavy diesel engine broke the nighttime stillness. I shifted silently toward the large bay window, keeping my body completely hidden behind the thick velvet curtains, and peered down at the long, winding driveway. A large matte black van, crudely disguised with generic reflective medical cross decals, rolled slowly toward the main entrance of the house. It parked directly in front of the grand foyer, leaving the engine idling with a low, menacing growl. The rear doors of the vehicle swung violently open. Bradley stepped out first, his movements jerky and visibly trembling with nervous energy. He was closely followed by Dr. Gregory Pierce, who carried a sleek black medical bag, his face set in a tight, grim line of professional corruption. Behind the physician emerged two massive, broad-shouldered men. They wore pristine white medical orderly uniforms, but their rigid posture, thick necks, and cold, highly alert movements clearly betrayed their true occupation. These were the cartel enforcers Monica had promised, heavily armed men sent to ensure the massive financial debt was paid in full one way or another. They were merciless killers masquerading as healthcare workers stepping directly into my personal sanctuary. I watched as one of the massive thugs reached into the back of the dark van and casually slung a heavy, thick canvas straitjacket over his massive shoulder. The other enforcer carried a small, specialized metal lockbox, undoubtedly containing the powerful chemical sedatives and the specialized biometric ink pad they desperately needed to force my thumbprint onto the legal conservatorship documents. They marched up the stone pathway with heavy synchronized steps, their sheer physical presence radiating a deeply lethal intent. The silver clasps of the straitjacket clinked softly in the quiet night air, a sickening lullaby signaling the violent end they had planned for me. I retreated from the window and returned to my concealed position behind the heavy oak doors of the master suite. Downstairs, the front door opened with a muffled click. I pressed my ear against the cool wood, listening to the distinct sounds of their intrusion. The heavy, thudding footsteps of the cartel thugs echoed loudly against the marble floor of the foyer, completely abandoning any pretense of medical discretion. I heard Bradley nervously whispering frantic instructions, desperately begging them to keep their voices down. Dr. Pierce murmured something about preparing the heavy dose, immediately warning them that the chemical cocktail needed to be administered the absolute second they secured my limbs. They began their slow, ominous ascent up the grand, sweeping staircase. The wooden steps groaned in loud protest under the immense combined weight of the execution squad. I tracked their steady progress with flawless precision, matching the sound of their heavy boots to the exact layout of the expansive second-floor hallway. They reached the top landing and paused. A heavy, suffocating tension immediately filled the air directly outside my bedroom. I heard the soft, nervous rustling of Bradley shifting his weight from foot to foot. He whispered to the doctor, asking if the massive sedative dose would permanently damage my heart. The cartel thug immediately growled at my son, ordering him to shut his pathetic mouth and unlock the door. The sheer naked contempt in the enforcer's deep voice mirrored Monica's earlier rage perfectly. I heard the sharp metallic scraping of a key sliding clumsily into the heavy brass lock. Bradley's hands were clearly trembling so violently that he could barely manipulate the simple mechanism. Finally, the deadbolt clicked loudly backward. The brass handle turned slowly, whining softly, in the dead quiet of the corridor. The heavy oak door was pushed gently inward, swinging wide to reveal the pitch-black expanse of the master suite. Bradley stepped cautiously over the threshold, his breathing ragged and shallow. The doctor and the two massive cartel thugs crowded closely behind him, their broad shoulders practically filling the large doorway. They paused in a tight clustered group, staring into the darkness. Bradley reached out and flicked the wall switch, instantly flooding the room with bright, blinding overhead light. He let out a sharp, confused gasp. His eyes darted frantically across the large room, scanning the perfectly stripped mattress, the empty armchairs, and the vacant corners. He stood completely frozen, his mind entirely unable to process the highly anticipated, deeply terrifying reality facing him. The meticulously planned extraction was ruined. The massive bed was now completely, utterly empty. Before his panicked brain could formulate a single word of warning, I stepped smoothly out from the deep shadows directly behind them. I grabbed the heavy brass handles of the massive double oak doors and pulled them toward me with every single ounce of my strength. The heavy wooden slabs slammed violently shut, striking the reinforced doorframe with the deafening explosive sound of a thunderclap. I instantly threw my full physical body weight forcefully against the thick wood and sharply twisted the solid brass interior deadbolt, securely locking them completely and irreversibly inside the inescapable trap of the master suite. The heavy oak doors of the master suite vibrated violently against their sturdy brass hinges as the trapped men inside began throwing their massive weight against the solid wood. Muffled shouts of confusion and sheer panic echoed from the confined space. Bradley screamed frantically, his high-pitched voice cracking with terror as he desperately realized they were completely trapped inside. I did not linger. I turned my back on their pathetic struggling and walked with perfect steady balance down the upper hallway toward my private, heavily secured personal study. The frail, broken old man they had so desperately wanted to exploit was entirely gone. I walked into the dark study and smoothly poured myself a generous measure of fine aged scotch into a heavy crystal glass. I grabbed the thick armrest of my favorite leather wingback chair and deliberately dragged the heavy piece of furniture out of the room, positioning it directly in the absolute center of the grand upper landing. The chair faced the violently shaking doors perfectly. I calmly sat down in the luxurious leather crossing my legs. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the smoky, burning liquid. The continuous heavy thudding against the oak doors grew significantly louder, followed by the sharp, splintering crack of stressed timber giving way. The highly trained cartel thugs were brutally efficient. With one final explosive kick, the thick brass deadbolt tore through the shattered wooden doorframe. The heavy doors burst violently outward, crashing loudly against the hallway walls. The four men stumbled out of the darkness of the master suite, their faces flushed with adrenaline. The exact moment their heavy boots touched the polished hardwood of the upper landing, I reached out and casually flipped the master wall switch. The crystal chandeliers lining the long hallway instantly flicked on, flooding the entire upper level of the sprawling estate with a brilliant, blinding golden light. The sudden illumination struck them like a physical blow. They froze in their tracks, shielding their sensitive eyes and completely freezing in absolute stunned silence. I sat before them holding my crystal glass, projecting the sharp, cold, and entirely merciless aura of the formidable chief executive they had foolishly tried to overthrow. I looked sharper and colder than I had in 20 long years. Bradley stumbled backward, blinking rapidly, utterly unable to process the terrifying image of his father sitting in the chair. He looked incredibly small wearing his expensive suit, but radiating the pathetic, frightened energy of a thoroughly beaten, completely cornered child. Dr. Gregory Pierce was the very first to break the heavy, suffocating silence. He desperately tried to salvage his corrupt clinical facade. He adjusted his wrinkled suit jacket, gripping the thick plastic barrel of a massive, chemically loaded syringe in his right hand. He took a slow, cautious step forward, offering me a tight, incredibly fake smile of professional medical concern. "Richard," he said, his voice smooth and deceptively calm, "you are experiencing a severe episode of cognitive disorientation. You need to return to your bed immediately. Please let me administer this mild sedative to help." I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle in my face. I took another slow, deeply satisfying sip of my scotch, letting my cold, unblinking stare bore directly into the corrupt physician's soul. "Dr. Pierce," I replied, my voice echoing with profound, unwavering authority. "If you take one more step toward me with that stolen chemical weapon, I will ensure that you spend the remainder of your miserable, pathetic life rotting away in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Your fraudulent medical evaluations have already been secured and transmitted directly to my attorneys." The doctor immediately stopped walking, the fake smile sliding entirely off his face. The two massive cartel thugs shifted uneasily, exchanging uncertain, highly anxious glances. They had been strictly promised an easy, entirely smooth extraction of a helpless, brain-dead old man. They were absolutely not prepared to face a deeply entrenched, fully alert billionaire actively guarding his own fortress. The larger of the two enforcers glared fiercely at Bradley, his deep voice rumbling with violent irritation. "What exactly is going on here?" he demanded. "You specifically told our employers that your father was completely incapacitated tonight." Bradley finally found his voice, though it was weak, high-pitched, and trembling with sheer, unadulterated terror. "Dad," he stammered, stepping nervously behind the broad shoulder of the nearest cartel thug. "Please, you have to understand. I had no other choice. They are going to kill me. They froze the banking portal. I cannot access the funds. You have to sign the emergency conservatorship papers right now. You have to let the doctor take your thumbprint. If you do not give them the money tonight, They are going to murder me and Monica without hesitation. I stared at my sweating, trembling son with profound, bottomless disgust. I had spent my entire life building an impenetrable shield to protect my family from the harsh, unforgiving realities of the world, and this pathetic creature had eagerly traded that vital protection for a fleeting, superficial illusion of power. Bradley, I said, my tone utterly devoid of any lingering paternal warmth. The primary financial accounts are not simply frozen due to a standard administrative banking error. I personally initiated an irrevocable blind trust. Every single dollar you tried to steal is completely permanently gone. The devastating words hit the small group like a physical shockwave. The cartel enforcers instantly realized the massive financial prize was no longer on the table. Their hostile, aggressive posturing immediately shifted away from me and focused entirely menacingly upon my son. Bradley let out a high, panicked gasp, shrinking back against the wall as the two massive thugs turned their furious, violent glares in his direction. He was completely out of time, utterly out of leverage, and entirely surrounded by lethal enemies. But the true, absolute depths of his horrific nightmare had not yet begun. He began to openly weep, begging the thugs for more time, promising them that he could still find a way to access the vanished corporate millions. He pleaded for his life, desperately invoking the name of his beloved wife, claiming that Monica would somehow figure out a brilliant solution to save them both. I reached smoothly into the pocket of my jacket and retrieved a small, sleek, black remote control that governed the integrated smart home automation system of the entire estate. I rested my thumb gently against the primary play button, locking eyes with my son. "I do not think your lovely wife is going to be of any assistance to you tonight," I stated coldly. I pressed the small button. Instantly, the crystal-clear, highly amplified audio recording of Monica secretly selling Bradley out to the cartel blasted loudly through the hidden surround sound speakers lining the hallway ceiling. Her vicious, calculating voice echoed around us coldly, arranging his immediate assassination and planning to enthusiastically inherit the remaining fortune as his grieving widow. The audio clip finished playing, leaving a ringing, catastrophic silence in its wake. Bradley stood completely paralyzed, his entire world crumbling into dust, as he turned his head and stared at the empty staircase in pure, shattered horror. The devastating echo of Monica's voice faded into the architecture of the upper landing, leaving a thick, suffocating silence. Bradley slowly turned his head away from the empty staircase, his eyes wide and completely hollow. He looked like a man whose soul had been violently ripped from his body. The absolute certainty of his wife's love, the foundational pillar of his treasonous operation, had just been exposed as a fatal illusion. He had destroyed his relationship with his father, ruined his career, and mortgaged his life to the cartel, all for a woman actively plotting his murder. Before Bradley could speak, the sharp, frantic clicking of designer heels echoed rapidly up the staircase. Monica burst onto the upper landing, her face flushed, her breathing ragged. The sound of her own secret conversation playing over the audio system had drawn her out of the kitchen in a blind, desperate panic. She stopped dead in her tracks the moment she reached the top of the stairs. Her terrified eyes swept over the shattered remnants of the master suite doors, the two cartel enforcers, the weeping frame of her husband, and finally me. I remained seated in my wingback chair, swirling the amber liquid in my glass, watching her carefully constructed world disintegrate. Monica opened her mouth to speak desperately, searching for a plausible lie to explain away the audio recording, but no words came out. Bradley stared at her with a sickening mixture of profound grief and boiling hatred. He took a single unsteady step toward her, his hands balled into trembling fists. He finally understood. He was nothing more than a disposable stepping stone in her ruthless pursuit of wealth. The larger of the two cartel thugs, however, possessed absolutely no interest in witnessing a crumbling marital dispute. The dramatic revelation of Monica's betrayal was irrelevant to his primary objective. He was a professional enforcer sent by extremely dangerous men to collect a massive $15 million debt, and he had just learned that the primary financial accounts were entirely frozen. The emergency conservatorship avenue to quietly transfer the corporate funds was undeniably dead. The careful extraction protocol had failed. The muscular thug let out a low, guttural growl of pure frustration. He reached up with a massive hand and violently ripped the white medical orderly mask away from his face, tossing it carelessly onto the polished hardwood floor. The charade of the polite medical professional was officially over. He turned his intimidating frame entirely toward me, his dark eyes narrowing into cold, merciless slits. He took 2 heavy, deliberate steps forward, closing the physical distance between us. His right hand slipped smoothly beneath the pristine white fabric of his medical scrubs. When his hand emerged a fraction of a second later, the atmosphere in the hallway instantly shifted from tense negotiation to immediate lethal danger. He was gripping a heavy matte black semi-automatic pistol. A long cylindrical sound suppressor was threaded tightly onto the barrel, transforming the deadly firearm into a highly efficient tool for murder. He raised the weapon with practiced precision, aiming the dark, hollow muzzle directly at the center of my chest. The absolute unyielding reality of extreme violence flooded the upper landing. Dr. Gregory Pierce let out a sharp, pathetic squeak of terror. The corrupt physician stumbled backward, dropping his medical bag and the massive chemically loaded syringe onto the floor. He raised his trembling hands in the air, his face completely drained of color. He had eagerly signed up for a highly lucrative, fraudulent medical conspiracy. He assumed he would simply administer a heavy sedative and collect a massive paycheck. He had absolutely never agreed to participate in an armed cartel execution. He pressed his back tightly against the hallway wall, paralyzed by the sudden appearance of the suppressed weapon. The cartel enforcer ignored the whimpering doctor. His dark, emotionless eyes remained locked entirely on me. "Listen to me very carefully, old man," he rumbled, his deep voice echoing with deadly authority. "The quiet legal route is officially dead. Your idiotic son and his treacherous wife have severely complicated our business, but our employers do not leave without their money. You will stand up, walk to your study, and open your wall safe. You will hand over every ounce of physical cash, every bearer bond, and every piece of jewelry. Then you will call your lawyers and physically authorize the reversal of the trust protocols." He stepped closer, the metal tip of the suppressor hovering less than 3 feet from my heart. "If you refuse," he continued, his tone devoid of empathy, "I will put a round directly through your right kneecap. If you still refuse, I will shoot your left kneecap. I will systematically disassemble your physical body until you give me the access codes. And when I am finished with you, I will execute your son, his wife, and the doctor, leaving this entire estate a bloody slaughterhouse." I sat perfectly still, maintaining my relaxed posture in the wingback chair. I did not break eye contact with the enforcer. I took one final slow sip of my fine scotch, feeling the warm, smoky liquid burn pleasantly down my throat. I lowered the glass. "You clearly do not understand the mechanics of an irrevocable blind trust," I replied, my voice steady, cold, and entirely unafraid. "The entire purpose of the financial vehicle is to remove all authorized control from the original owner. I am completely locked out of my own accounts. I could not reverse the monetary transfer even if I desperately wanted to. And my private safe contains nothing more than sentimental family photographs and old tax documents. There is absolutely nothing in this house for you to steal." The thug sneered, his finger tightening visibly on the curved metal trigger of the suppressed pistol. He clearly did not believe me, or he simply did not care about the complex logistical realities of Swiss banking law. "Then we will start with the knees," he growled, preparing to fire the first crippling shot. Before the hammer could strike, the deafening explosive roar of shattering glass violently interrupted the standoff. The massive architectural windows lining the front of the grand staircase blew inward with a spectacular, thunderous crash. Thousands of razor-sharp shards of broken glass rained down onto the polished hardwood floor, sparkling in the golden light. The sudden violent breach sent a massive shockwave of displaced air through the upper landing. The enforcer instinctively flinched, his finger momentarily pausing on the trigger as the chaotic noise filled the estate. through the shattered, gaping holes in the thick glass, cutting precisely through the swirling cloud of dust and falling debris. A series of bright, blindingly intense red laser sights suddenly pierced the darkness. The brilliant red beams swept flawlessly into the hallway, moving with absolute terrifying military precision. The laser sights instantly locked onto their designated targets. A glowing red dot settled perfectly onto the lead enforcer's chest. A second red beam painted the forehead of the other cartel thug. A third laser illuminated the trembling chest of Dr. Gregory Pierce, while a fourth steady red dot rested directly over Monica's pounding heart. The brilliant red laser sights remained perfectly steady, painting deadly glowing targets directly over the racing hearts of the intruders standing frozen on my upper landing. For a fraction of a second, the universe seemed to hold its collective breath. The armed cartel enforcer, a man who had undoubtedly orchestrated countless acts of ruthless violence, stared down at the blinding red dot, illuminating the center of his pristine white medical scrubs. The supreme, unquestionable confidence that had fueled his murderous threats completely evaporated, replaced instantly by the cold, paralyzing realization that he had walked blindly into a highly coordinated, inescapable federal trap. Before the enforcer could even twitch his finger toward the trigger of his suppressed pistol, the heavy custom-reinforced front doors of the estate were violently blown off their massive hinges. A deafening percussive explosion shook the entire foundation of the house, followed immediately by the overwhelming, chaotic roar of heavily armed tactical agents flooding into the grand foyer. Bright, blinding beams of tactical flashlights sliced through the swirling dust and pure darkness of the lower level. The booming, authoritative voices of federal agents echoed rapidly up the sweeping staircase, screaming absolute commands that left absolutely no room for negotiation or resistance. Federal agents, drop your lethal weapons immediately. Keep your hands exactly where we can see them. Do it now. The sheer overwhelming scale of the tactical breach was magnificent to witness. Dozens of agents clad in body armor swarmed up the grand staircase, their assault rifles raised and perfectly sighted on the group gathered helplessly on the landing. The lead cartel thug, calculating his miserable odds of survival in a fraction of a heartbeat, made the only logical decision available to him. He slowly opened his massive fingers, allowing the heavy, matte black suppressed pistol to slip from his grip. The deadly weapon clattered loudly against the highly polished hardwood floor, sliding harmlessly away toward the wooden banister. He slowly raised his thick, tattooed hands high into the air, completely surrendering his false and broken authority to the overwhelming power of the state. The tactical agents descended upon them with brutal practiced efficiency. 3 armored men tackled the lead enforcer, driving his body face first into the hardwood floor with a sickening thud. They wrenched his arms violently behind his back, securing his wrists with thick plastic zip ties. The second cartel thug offered no physical resistance. He immediately dropped down to his knees, lacing his fingers securely behind his head, as agents quickly swarmed him, thoroughly patting him down for concealed weapons before binding his hands. Dr. Gregory Pierce, watching his lucrative fraudulent medical conspiracy disintegrate into a horrifying federal nightmare, let out a pathetic, high-pitched shriek of panic. He frantically raised his hands, shaking his head wildly side to side. "I am a licensed medical professional," he stammered, his voice cracking with absolute terror. "I was simply hired to perform a standard psychiatric evaluation. I have absolutely nothing to do with these violent men. You cannot arrest me." A massive federal agent completely ignored the corrupt physician's desperate pleas. The agent stepped forward rapidly, grabbed the doctor roughly by the lapels of his suit jacket, and slammed him forcefully against the decorative hallway wallpaper. The impact knocked the remaining breath directly out of the doctor's lungs. The agent quickly kicked the doctor's legs apart, forcing him into a wide, vulnerable stance, and thoroughly searched his pockets before snapping a pair of heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his trembling wrists. The medical bag containing the lethal chemical sedatives was immediately confiscated and secured as primary physical evidence. As the chaotic, violent securing of the active threats concluded, a deeply familiar figure calmly walked up the grand staircase. Thomas Kensington ascended the wooden steps with the smooth, unhurried pace of a man taking a casual evening stroll. He was impeccably dressed, in a tailored charcoal suit, holding a thick, expanding manila folder securely in his left hand. He bypassed the loudly groaning cartel thugs and the weeping physician coming to a halt directly in front of my wingback chair. He offered me a brief, respectful nod before turning his sharp, calculating gaze entirely upon my treacherous daughter-in-law. Monica had been completely silent during the tactical breach, her mind undoubtedly racing to formulate a miraculous avenue of escape. Realizing that running was now physically impossible, she instantly resorted to the only weapon she had left. She collapsed dramatically onto her knees, burying her face in her hands, and began to sob with magnificent heart-wrenching theatricality. She looked up at Thomas, her wide eyes brimming with perfectly manufactured, incredibly convincing tears. "Thank God you are here," she cried out, her voice trembling with artificial relief. "These horrible, violent men broke into the house. They forced Bradley to bring them here. They were going to kill Richard. I tried to stop them. You have to believe me. I was just trying to protect my family." Thomas stared down at her with a look of profound, unyielding disgust. He did not say a single word. He simply unclasped the thick manila folder and pulled out a stack of legally bound documents. He held up the first page, displaying it clearly under the bright light of the crystal chandeliers. "This is a certified, expedited toxicology report from the primary medical laboratory," Thomas stated, his voice echoing coldly across the quiet landing. "It conclusively proves the presence of lethal, unauthorized chemical sedatives in Richard's bloodstream, matching the exact haloperidol compound retrieved from your personal kitchen." Furthermore, he continued, pulling out a second document bearing the seal of a federal judge. "This is a highly classified federal wiretap warrant. The authorities have been actively monitoring your private cellular communications for the past 72 hours. We possess crystal clear, undeniable audio recordings of you independently negotiating a brutal murder-for-hire contract with the Miami Syndicate." Monica's theatrical sobbing ceased instantly. The sweet, innocent mask shattered completely, revealing the cold, calculating, incredibly venomous predator hiding underneath. As two female federal agents stepped forward and roughly hauled her to her feet, locking handcuffs tightly around her wrists, she glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. She did not utter another single word as they marched her aggressively down the staircase. Bradley was the only one left standing untouched. He was completely surrounded by heavily armed tactical agents, yet entirely ignored a man deemed utterly insignificant. He looked around the hallway, watching his dangerous wife, his corrupt doctor, and his lethal enforcers being dragged away into the night. The terrible, crushing reality of his situation finally settled heavily upon his narrow shoulders. The massive fortune was completely gone. His marriage was a lethal, manipulative lie. His entire life was officially, irrecoverably over. He collapsed heavily onto his knees on the lowest steps of the upper landing, absolutely unable to move any further. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his pale, sweating face, his body trembling violently. "Dad," he sobbed, begging his father to save him from federal prison. "Please help me." Richard walks slowly down the stairs, towering over his kneeling son. He looks down with absolute icy detachment. I took my first deliberate step down the grand staircase, moving with the measured grace of a monarch, surveying the smoking ruins of a conquered rebellion. The heavy, chaotic sounds of the tactical raid were receding, replaced by the sharp barks of federal agents processing the prisoners. Flashing red and blue lights from the armada of armored vehicles parked across my driveway cast long, erratic shadows through the violently shattered framework of the front windows. I descended another step, eyes locked onto the pathetic, trembling figure of the son I had raised. Bradley remained collapsed on his knees, his expensive designer suit covered in drywall dust and pulverized glass. His shoulders heaved with violent, uncontrollable sobs, his hands clutching at empty air as if trying to grasp a lifeline that no longer existed. I reached the bottom landing, stopping inches away from his trembling form. I towered over him, my posture rigidly straight, projecting an aura of absolute, icy detachment. He slowly tilted his head upward, His face was a horrific mask of sweat and genuine terror. The arrogant boy who had eagerly conspired to strip away my freedom was entirely gone. In his place was a hollow, broken creature, finally grasping the apocalyptic consequences of his own monumental stupidity. "Dad, please," he whimpered, his voice cracking into a high, desperate squeak. "You have to stop them. You have to tell Thomas to call off the agents. I cannot go to a federal prison. I will not survive in a place like that. You know I am not a criminal. I was manipulated. Monica forced me into this corner. She poisoned my mind against you. She made me believe you were losing your memory. I did not want to hurt you. Please, you have the best corporate defense lawyers in the country on your payroll. You can afford to fix this. Just release a fraction of the blind trust. Hire a legal team for me. I will do whatever you want. I will spend the rest of my life making this right. Just do not let them lock me inside a concrete cage." His words tumbled out in a frantic rush, a sickening cascade of transparent lies and cowardly deflections. He was willing to throw his wife away, attempting to rewrite history and paint himself as a tragic victim. He reached out with a trembling hand, attempting to grasp my trousers. I took a deliberate step backward, rejecting his touch with profound disgust. I looked down at the weeping man, feeling the finality of my decision harden, like cooling steel within my chest. "You are fundamentally incapable of taking responsibility for your actions." "Bradley," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold authority that sliced effortlessly through his pathetic sobbing. "You stand here surrounded by heavily armed federal agents, and your first instinct is to beg me to purchase your salvation. You eagerly conspired with a fraudulent physician to poison my bloodstream. You brought lethal cartel enforcers into the sacred halls of my home. You attempted to steal $15 million of the wealth I spent 40 years bleeding to build. You did this out of pure, unadulterated greed. And you failed entirely because you possess absolutely none of the iron will required to be a predator. You sold your blood for a woman who was actively planning your funeral, Bradley. She was negotiating the price of your assassination while you were rushing out to fetch her executioners. If I were to magically dismiss these federal charges tonight, those cartel enforcers would butcher you before the sun crests over the horizon. They would skin you alive for losing their money. Federal prison is the absolute only place on this earth the cartel cannot reach you. I am not simply sending you to a concrete cell. I am literally saving your miserable life. But you will serve your time without a single cent of my corporate wealth. I will not fund your defense. I will not pay for a legal team. And when you finally step out of that cage, you will no longer bear my name. You are entirely stripped of your inheritance, your privileges, and your legacy. You are no longer an Alden. The absolute finality of my verdict struck him with the devastating force of a physical blow. Bradley let out a hollow wail, collapsing forward until his forehead rested against the dusty floorboards, his body convulsing with the gravity of his absolute ruin. A sudden, sharp burst of vicious laughter pierced the heavy air of the foyer. I shifted my gaze slightly. 2 federal agents were forcefully dragging Monica toward the shattered main entrance. She had stopped her theatrical crying the exact second she realized her performance was utterly useless. She had listened to my entire speech, absorbing the catastrophic reality of her own impending doom. The wiretap warrants and the undeniable toxicology reports guaranteed she would face a minimum of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for criminal conspiracy and attempted murder. The sweet, beautifully manicured daughter-in-law vanished completely, replaced by a snarling, venomous creature cornered by the inescapable consequences of her own boundless greed. She twisted her neck around, glaring back at me with cold eyes completely devoid of any human warmth. "You miserable, heartless old bastard," she spat, her voice dripping with pure, toxic hatred. "You think you have won. You think you are so brilliant sitting upon your pathetic throne. You are going to die completely alone in this massive, incredibly empty mausoleum. Your once great legacy is completely dead and buried. Your son is a pathetic coward, and your grand empire will turn to dust." She bared her teeth looking like a feral trapped animal, completely consumed by her own toxic malice. The federal agents did not tolerate her outburst. They yanked her roughly forward, pushing her aggressively through the ruined doorway and out into the flashing lights of the waiting transport vehicles. Her vicious curses faded into the chaotic noise, leaving a profound, cleansing silence in her wake. I stood perfectly still, in the center of the devastated foyer, watching the tactical teams process the final remnants of the shattered conspiracy. Thomas Kensington stepped quietly to my side, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the tactical body armor of the federal agents swarming the property. He held the thick manila folder securely under his arm, his sharp eyes scanning the remarkable scene of absolute destruction and legal victory. The operation was executed flawlessly, Richard. Thomas murmured, his tone maintaining its usual detached calm. The primary cartel enforcers are in federal custody. The corrupt physician has already begun aggressively bargaining for a plea deal, and the localized threat to your personal safety has been entirely neutralized. I slowly nodded, my gaze dropping one last time to the kneeling, broken figure of my son. Two large agents stepped forward, grabbing Bradley firmly by his shoulders and hauling him roughly to his feet. He did not resist. He hung completely limp in their strong grasp, his eyes vacant and staring blankly into the distance, a man whose entire universe had been comprehensively erased. I watched without a single shred of lingering emotion as they marched him out the door. The heavy, suffocating weight of the previous months, the endless paranoia and the bitter deception finally evaporated into the cool night air. The brutal conflict was officially over. I turned away from the shattered glass and walked slowly back up the grand staircase. Exactly 1 month has passed since that chaotic night on of federal intervention. The massive shattered windows in the grand foyer have been entirely replaced with reinforced glass, and the heavy oak doors of the master suite completely rebuilt. The physical scars inflicted upon the estate have been meticulously erased, but the profound silence that now fills the sprawling house is the most significant change. It is a deeply peaceful, unburdened silence. I sit comfortably behind the polished mahogany desk in my private study, the bright morning sun streaming through the large bay windows, casting a warm golden glow across the room. The legal proceedings were swift and absolutely merciless. My corporate attorneys moved with surgical precision, executing a complete and irrevocable severing of all familial ties. Bradley is no longer a recognized member of our family. He has been completely stripped of his inheritance, entirely removed from every trust fund, and permanently banned from the corporate logistics empire I spent my life bleeding to build. I understand he is currently awaiting trial in a federal holding facility, relying entirely on a deeply overworked public defender. I do not monitor his daily progress. I do not send letters. I have completely excised the treacherous cancer from my life. The only individual who demonstrated unwavering loyalty during my manufactured decline was Rosa. I called her into my office yesterday afternoon. She stood nervously before my desk, her hands clasped together, perhaps fearing she was being dismissed. Instead, I handed her a thick, legally binding contract and a small velvet box. I officially promoted her to the prestigious position of General Estate Manager, permanently doubling her salary and granting her a massive immediate financial bonus for her steadfast dedication. Inside the velvet box was a set of pristine keys to a brand new luxury sedan waiting in the driveway. She wept, but these were tears of genuine gratitude, a stark contrast to the venomous sobbing I had witnessed from my former daughter-in-law. I leaned back in my heavy leather executive chair, taking a slow, deliberate sip from a porcelain cup of black coffee. It is a clean, pure cup of coffee. There is absolutely no trace of the chalky, bitter chemical sedatives that Monica had so ruthlessly slipped into my daily routine. The taste of uncompromised clarity is magnificent. I turn my attention back to the thick stack of corporate logistics contracts resting securely on my desk. The international supply chain empire is booming, completely untouched by Bradley's foolish, desperate attempts to siphon its lifeblood into the hands of a violent cartel. The stock valuations have surged over the past 4 weeks, solidifying our absolute dominance in the global market. I took a substantial emotional hit. A father should never have to watch his only son willingly march into the arms of predators out of pure greed. I had spent decades building an impenetrable fortress around him, shielding him from the brutal realities of the harsh world, only to realize he had eagerly invited the wolves inside. He mistook my quiet, aging demeanor for weakness. He mistook my paternal patience for cognitive decline. He fundamentally misunderstood the very nature of the man who created his luxurious reality. He assumed I was a relic ready to be discarded. But the empire remains standing vastly stronger than before. The treacherous elements have been entirely eradicated, swept away by the precise, overwhelming force of the federal government and my own uncompromising resolve. I am an old man, but my mind is razor sharp, my vision is absolutely clear, and my iron grip on my legacy is firmer than it has ever been in my entire life. I survived the darkest betrayal a father could possibly face, and I emerged completely victorious. I am no longer looking over my shoulder. I am no longer playing the part of the broken, heavily sedated victim. The grand stage has been cleared of its worst actors. The wolves came for the old man, but they entirely forgot that he was the apex predator who built the entire forest. They came searching for an easy meal, but they found a man completely willing to burn his own bloodline to the ground to protect the empire he forged. The house is finally quiet, perfectly secure, and entirely under my own absolute control. My legacy will endure untouched by the greedy hands of those who thought they could simply take what they did not earn. I look out the window at the sprawling grounds, feeling a deep, resounding satisfaction settle into my bones. The storm has officially passed, leaving only strength in its wake. I am Richard Alden, and I will never be a victim again. Family is often portrayed as an unbreakable bond, but blood does not guarantee loyalty, and age does not equate to weakness. The greatest mistake a predator can make is assuming that a quiet older man has lost his teeth. Greed blinds people to the very foundation of the empires they wish to steal. True power does not come from manipulation or deceit. It comes from decades of hard-earned wisdom, patience, and the ability to strike with absolute precision when the time is right. Trust your instincts, protect what you built, and never let anyone mistake your kindness for foolishness. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button to support the channel. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling content.